"James Archer, you're under arrest." Those were the first words I could make out after being knocked to the ground. My arms were yanked painfully behind my back, and the handcuffs were so tight, it felt like they were slicing my hands off. I had just gone to answer the door when it happened. The moment I opened it, 4 uniformed officers burst through, knocking me over and charging into my house. I was hauled up roughly as 3 more people in plain clothes walked in behind them. "Mr. Archer, we have a warrant to search the premises," one of the men, graying at the temples, said, snapping a piece of paper in front of my face. "Get him out of here." "Wait!" I shouted, struggling to free myself from the officers gripping me. "There's been a mistake." But before I could get another word out, they spun me around and slammed me into the door frame. My glasses flew off, and I felt a sharp pain shoot through my face. "Resisting arrest, pervert!" one of the officers hissed as he shoved me into the door. "Enough!" the first man barked. "Just get him down to booking." A million thoughts flooded my mind as they practically tossed me into the back of a police car. But the biggest worry on my mind was my 2 kids, Grace, who was 12, and Ethan, who was 11. The officer who had thrown me into the door climbed into the driver's seat, buckled up, and started driving off. "Look," I said, trying to sit up, wincing from the pain in my wrists. "My kids will be home from school soon. You have to. You don't need anything but to shut your mouth," the officer snarled, cutting me off. "These are my kids," I yelled. Before I knew it, I was slamming into the heavy grill separating the front and back of the car as the officer slammed on the brakes. I learned later that physics has a principle that says an object in motion stays in motion. Well, I was going about 35 miles an hour when the cops slammed on the brakes, and the grill stopped me cold. The officer turned around in his seat and sneered at me. "One more word, scumbag, and I'll come back there and beat you senseless." My body cam is off, by the way. I managed to turn my head enough to avoid breaking my nose, but my cheek was swelling by the minute. I stayed quiet until we reached the station. When we pulled into the prisoner's garage, the officer locked up his weapon before yanking me out of the car and dragging me into the booking area. A female officer was waiting there for us. "Paperwork?" she asked, just before the other officer handed her the forms. "What happened to him?" she asked, eyeing the officer who had brought me in. "Resisting arrest," he replied, securing leg irons around my ankles. She shrugged, unfazed. As she removed the handcuffs from me, I breathed a small sigh of relief. After taking my front and side photos and scanning my fingerprints, she started asking routine questions. "Height?" she asked. 6 feet, I replied. "Weight?" 210. "Charges?" "I don't know. No one's told me what they are." With a sigh, she started leafing through the paperwork she had been given. I watched her face go from pale to crimson as she looked at the papers. She marched over to a nearby cell and flung open the door, pointing inside. "May I make a phone call first?" I asked. Without a word, she pointed to the phone on the wall. "One call." I quickly dialed the law firm that handles the business side of things for my company. I had invented 2 medical clamps during college, which had taken off. The royalties gave me and my family a comfortable lifestyle. "Marshall, Evans and Hudson, how can we help?" "Hello, this is James Archer. Is Derek Lawson in?" I asked. "Hold, please." After about 30 seconds of elevator music, the line clicked. "Mr. Archer, this is Tom Mitchell. How can I assist you today?" "I've been arrested and need some help." "Mr. Archer, I regret to inform you that our firm cannot represent you due to a conflict of interest." "Conflict of interest?" I lost it. "You're my damn law firm." "I'm afraid not," Mitchell said, and just like that, the line went dead. I turned to see the female officer standing next to the cell door. "Get in," she ordered. Confused but unwilling to argue, I shuffled inside, my leg cuffs dragging behind me. She slammed the door shut and walked away, taking deep breaths, probably to calm herself down. It felt like hours before they finally brought me in front of a county commissioner to set my initial bail. That's when I learned the charges: solicitation of a minor. I jumped to my feet. What the hell? I would never do anything like that. A heavy hand from the transport officer pressed me back into my seat. "I'm not here to determine guilt or innocence, just bail," the commissioner said. "The charge is a felony, punishable by up to 10 years in prison and a $225,000 fine." Bail is set at $500,000. You can post bail with cash or property or hire a bondsman, but you'll have to pay 10% of the total. If you can't post bail, you'll appear before a judge tomorrow morning for a bail review. Back at the precinct, I spent the next few hours calling everyone I knew. My wife, Rebecca's phone had been disconnected, and no one answered at work. I knew I had over $600,000 in a savings account, plus a fully paid-off house, and my business, everything I could use for collateral. I wasn't about to pay a bondsman $50,000 for what was clearly a mistake. I managed to sleep for a couple of hours, only to be woken up by a breakfast box and a small bottle of orange juice. I couldn't get back on the phone because another inmate was using it, and soon enough myself and 3 other prisoners were being carted off to district court. We were locked into a holding cell in the basement of the building, and not long after, an officer shouted my name. "Mr. Archer," he called, "someone's here to see you." "Who?" I asked, approaching the cell door. "Rebecca Archer," said a young woman. I blinked. "What?" She handed me a piece of paper. "You've been served." I barely had time to process what I was reading. It was a restraining order. "You're hereby ordered to stay 500 feet away from Rebecca Archer, Grace Archer, and Ethan Archer," the paper read. "You must also stay away from their residences, places of business, and schools. Do you understand the order?" I barely comprehended the words. When I opened the first envelope, the full impact hit me. It was a limited divorce petition. A limited divorce is a legal separation, and final divorce proceedings would only start after 12 months of living apart. Rebecca had initiated both the restraining order and the divorce papers, and I was left reeling. We were going through a rough patch, but I never saw this coming. Rebecca and I had met in college back when I was just starting to make a name for myself with my inventions. We got married young, at 22. Now at 36, everything was crumbling around me. At the bail review the next day, things only got worse. The prosecutor added another charge, possession of child pornography. I was adamant I was innocent, but my protests only angered the judge. My bail was denied, and I was sent to county jail to await trial. Jail was hell. They call it rough for a reason. I was shoved, punched, and kicked, but by some miracle, I avoided the worst of it, mainly because I was isolated in my cell for most of the time, with an escort when I went to the bathroom. I contacted a number of lawyers for my trial and my divorce. Every single one of them told me Rebecca had already been to see them, and they couldn't represent me due to a conflict of interest. To make matters worse, I learned that my business and all its assets had been placed in trust to Grace and Ethan by a family court judge after my arrest. And to top it all off, Rebecca had used an old, but still valid, power of attorney to remove my name from everything. I didn't know how to fight back. It felt like my life had been stolen from me. As I sat in that dingy jail cell, the reality of what had happened to me continued to sink in. I was facing a battle on all fronts: my freedom, my reputation, my business, and now my family. The worst part, though, was realizing that Rebecca, the woman I had spent half my life with, was behind all of it. She had been plotting against me, pulling strings, and leaving me in the dark while she built a new life for herself. I had learned from my lawyers that Rebecca had emptied our joint bank accounts right after my arrest. Every single penny I had worked for, every dime from my patents was gone. Not only that, but she had also sold the house we had built together. She knew she could get away with it because, thanks to my arrest, she was in full control of everything. All my assets, my company, my business, my patents had been transferred to a trust for Grace and Ethan. The judge, who was clearly on her side, had signed off on it without even considering my side of the story. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was the betrayal. While I was sitting in jail, completely alone, she had moved on. I found out through prison gossip that Rebecca had already remarried. She had tied the knot with Ryan Westbrook, a rising star at the law firm of Marshall, Evans and Hudson, the same firm that had dumped me like a hot potato once the charges were filed. That news hit me like a ton of bricks. Ryan was climbing the ladder in the legal world, and now he was the one sharing a bed with my wife. The next blow came a few months later. I was sitting in the prison yard, lost in thought, when I heard about Rebecca's new life. Not only had she remarried, but she was also preparing to make Ryan a partner at the law firm. It was like she had planned everything down to the smallest detail, leaving nothing to chance. She had managed to rebuild her life, while I was sitting in a cell with no way out. I was furious, but I had no way to fight back, at least not from behind bars. But I wasn't completely helpless. I still had some connections, even if they were slim. I used what little money I had left to bribe an inmate, a guy who owed me a favor, to gather information. After a couple of days of digging around, he came back with the address to Rebecca and Ryan's new home. I had nothing left to lose. I had been paroled, but my life outside of prison wasn't much better. I was stuck in a halfway house with a sadistic counselor and barely scraping by as a nighttime janitor in a large office building. My engineering degree and my MBA meant nothing in the eyes of society when I was labeled a registered sex offender. Still, I wasn't going to sit around and let Rebecca have the last laugh. 2 days after my release, I found myself standing in a park across from their condo building, watching. It was late in the afternoon, and I had just finished my shift. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited. And then, I saw them. Ethan, now 13, walked out of the building first. He had grown so much since I last saw him. He had shot up at least 8 inches, and all his baby fat was gone. He looked skinny, almost fragile, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of regret and loss. He didn't even know who I was anymore, and I had no right to call him my son anymore. Behind him, Grace emerged. At 15, she was the spitting image of Rebecca, long, brunette hair cascading down to her waist. Seeing her was like looking at a ghost from my past, a version of Rebecca I used to love. The sight hit me like a wave of emotion I hadn't expected. The two of them climbed into a small white bus and were gone. I wiped the tears from my eyes, standing there in silence. It became a ritual for me. Every morning, I would be there, watching them get on that bus that would take them to their private school. It was my only connection to them, and it tortured me every single day. But I wasn't done yet. I still had a score to settle, and I would find a way to make Rebecca pay for what she had done. I started to gather evidence. I had been in the business world long enough to know how to dig into people's affairs, how to track down their financials, and how to expose them for the frauds they really were. Rebecca thought she had won. She thought I was out of the picture for good, but she didn't count on me still having a few cards left to play. A couple of months later, I found the first piece of the puzzle. I had someone on the inside who had access to Rebecca and Ryan's financials. It took some work, but I was able to confirm that Rebecca had been skimming money from the trust set up for Grace and Ethan. She was using the children's inheritance to fund her lavish lifestyle. And worse, Ryan had been helping her cover it up. I knew this was my chance. I couldn't fight her in court, not yet, at least, but I could expose her. I had gathered enough evidence to take her down, to show the world who she really was. And I knew exactly how to use that information. I sent the documents to the media, to the journalists I had once worked with before all of this began. They jumped on the story. Soon enough, the press was all over Rebecca, Ryan, and their financial crimes. The law firm of Marshall, Evans, and Hudson, which had backed Rebecca, was dragged into the mess as well. Rebecca's perfect little world crumbled around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As the media storm grew, I sat back and watched. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense, but it was enough. Rebecca's reputation was destroyed. Her fancy lawyer husband was no longer viewed as a rising star, but as an accomplice to fraud. And my children? They knew the truth about what had happened, even if they never fully understood the depth of Rebecca's betrayal. I didn't stop there. Once the storm had settled, I took action to ensure that Rebecca would never see a penny of the money I had earned. The final blow came when I used the legal loopholes I had been researching to have her access to the trust blocked. Every cent that had been stolen from my children was returned, and all her assets were frozen. In the end, Rebecca had nothing. Her new life, built on lies and betrayal, had been ripped apart. And I had nothing left to lose, except the pain of what had been. The hardest part was knowing that Grace and Ethan would grow up with a distorted view of me, but at least they would know that, in the end, I fought back. I walked away from it all, knowing that no matter how much I had lost, I had exposed the truth. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. I had taken everything from Rebecca, her reputation, her new life, her false sense of security. She had spent so long scheming and plotting, manipulating everyone around her, thinking she could leave me behind in a prison cell while she moved on with her perfect little world. But in the end, I wasn't the one who had lost everything. It was her. Still, despite the satisfaction of seeing her world fall apart, there was a gnawing emptiness that followed me like a shadow. I had no idea where I would go from here, or what the next step was. The media coverage had died down, the legal battles were ongoing, and my children, Grace and Ethan, were growing up without me, their perception of me shaped by the lies Rebecca had told them. It was painful, yes, but I couldn't change the past. But life has a funny way of giving you something you don't expect, something you never saw coming, no matter how carefully you think you planned your next move. It happened on an ordinary day. At least it started out that way. I had moved into a small, rundown apartment after my release. The halfway house had given me the basic foundation to get my feet under me, but I quickly realized I couldn't stay there forever. My nights were spent working as a janitor, my days spent trying to reestablish some semblance of normalcy. I had started to attend meetings, hoping to build a life that, at least on the surface, resembled something meaningful. My engineering background meant I had some skills, but who was going to hire a registered sex offender with my record? I kept my head low, trying not to attract attention, trying to stay out of the way of people who could hurt me. The world had turned its back on me, and I had no choice but to accept it. Or so I thought. It was about 6 months after the media circus had died down, when I was still trying to rebuild, that I ran into someone I never thought I would see again. I had been walking back to my apartment after a long shift at the office building. The city was starting to settle into the late evening, and I could hear the hum of traffic in the distance. I was tired physically and mentally, and I wasn't really paying attention to where I was going when I bumped into her. Rebecca. She was standing on the corner, looking almost out of place, as if she wasn't sure what she was doing there. She was still beautiful, despite everything. Long brown hair, flawless skin, the same piercing eyes that used to hold all my attention. But she wasn't the same woman I had known. There was something different about her. Something was off. She was the first to speak. James, her voice was soft, almost unsure. I froze. My heart raced in my chest, and for a moment I couldn't move. I had spent so long hating her, plotting my revenge, and now, here she was standing right in front of me. I hadn't seen her since the divorce papers were served, and I had convinced myself that I was done with her. But the sight of her brought back memories, good and bad. The good ones were harder to face, but the bad ones were what kept me alive. "What do you want?" I said, trying to sound stronger than I felt. I didn't want to seem vulnerable. Not to her. Rebecca hesitated before answering. I need to talk to you." I looked at her, confused. Talk? After everything? What could we possibly have left to talk about? I've been going through a lot," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I made a mistake, James. I know I hurt you. And I just need you to hear me out." I wanted to say something cutting, to tell her that I wasn't interested in her apologies, that everything was done between us. But there was something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in years, guilt. And not just guilt, there was fear. "I'm listening," I said, trying to remain detached, even though part of me wanted to hear what she had to say. Rebecca swallowed hard, looking around as though she were trying to gather her thoughts. Then, as if it had been building up inside her for months, she said it. "I'm pregnant, James. And it's Ryan's." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, unable to process what she had just said. Ryan Westbrook, the man who had taken my place, the man who had stood by her side while I rotted in prison. He was the father of her child? I had suspected that something was off with their relationship, that maybe there had been more than just the affair, but hearing her say it out loud was something else entirely. I had no idea what to say. I felt a cold, sickening wave of anger rush through me, but it wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something more profound. Betrayal. The ultimate betrayal. Rebecca looked down at her feet, clearly expecting me to explode, to shout at her, to curse her out the way I had every day in prison. But I didn't. I just stood there, silent. I couldn't bring myself to react. "I'm sorry, James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could make it work with Ryan. But now that everything's come out, I don't know where to turn. I didn't want you to find out like this. I should have told you before, but I was scared." "Scared?" I repeated, finally finding my voice. "Scared of what? You already took everything from me, Rebecca. My money, my reputation, my family. And now you want me to feel sorry for you?" She nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I didn't plan this, James. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. When I started seeing Ryan, I thought it was just a rebound. But then things got complicated. I don't even know how to explain it." I let out a bitter laugh, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. "So now you're pregnant with his kid, and you want me to somehow make sense of all this? You think I'm just going to forgive you?" "No," she said quickly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I need you to know the truth. I couldn't carry this secret anymore." I stood there, staring at her, and something inside me snapped. For the first time in years, I saw the full extent of her betrayal. The affair, the lies, the way she had discarded me when I was at my lowest point. But something else, something unexpected, was building inside me. It wasn't just anger. It was pity. Pity for the woman who had everything but still couldn't find peace. Pity for the woman who had thought she could take everything from me and still live happily ever after. She was pregnant with Ryan's child, and for some reason, I couldn't find it in me to care. She had chosen him, not me. And that's when I realized that I didn't need to fight her anymore. I didn't need revenge. Rebecca had already lost. I looked at her one last time, feeling that all too familiar weight in my chest, the weight of the past, and I said, "You should have thought about that before. Before everything. Before you lied to me. Before you destroyed our family." I turned and started walking away, feeling the weight of her gaze on my back. As I walked away from her, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel anger or pain anymore. I just felt free. I had spent so many years in the prison of my mind, consumed by the past, by the betrayal. But in that moment, I realized that I no longer had to carry it with me. Rebecca's new life, her new family, and the child she was carrying were hers to deal with. But for me, I was free, and that was more than I could have hoped for after everything she had taken from me. I had never been one to believe in fate. Before all of this, before Rebecca's betrayal, before my arrest and imprisonment, I had built my life on the belief that I could control my destiny. Hard work, loyalty, and ambition were the tools I believed in. But as I walked away from Rebecca that day, there was an undeniable shift within me, something I hadn't expected to feel at that point in my life: freedom. Not just from Rebecca, but from everything she had entangled me in. The webs of deceit, the anger, the constant feeling of being trapped. As I walked through the streets of the city, something inside me began to change. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about what was happening to Rebecca, to Ryan, or to any of the people who had turned their backs on me. I wasn't obsessed with proving my innocence anymore or chasing a future that was built on lies. I was focused on one thing: what I wanted. The weight that had been pressing on my chest since I was first arrested, years ago now, had lifted. It felt like I was finally breathing again. In the weeks that followed my meeting with Rebecca, I started to notice the subtle shifts in my life. The small, but significant changes that I hadn't expected. I began spending more time doing things I had always wanted to do, but had never had the time for. I took up running, started reading again, really reading, not the legal documents or case files I had been buried under for years. It was freeing. I started looking at my life from a fresh perspective, one not clouded by the past, but clear and open. My focus shifted from surviving to actually living. The job at the office building that I had taken when I was released, mopping floors and emptying trash cans, was still a part of my life, but it didn't feel like a dead end anymore. I saw it as a stepping stone. I didn't have to stay there forever, and I wasn't going to. Slowly but surely, I was putting the pieces back together. I was starting to see that I didn't need Rebecca's approval or the approval of anyone who had walked out on me. I had my dignity, my strength, and now I had the ability to move forward. It was around this time that I met someone unexpected. Her name was Maria. She worked at the same office building as I did. She was a janitor too, but unlike me, she had been there for years, working her way up. We started talking one day over lunch, and what started as small talk quickly turned into deep, meaningful conversation. She wasn't like the others I had met. She didn't look at me with pity or judgment. She saw me as who I was, a man who had been through hell, but was still standing. Maria had been through her own struggles. She was in her early 40s, had a son who was now an adult, and had spent most of her life working hard to support him. Her ex-husband had walked out on her years ago, and she had struggled with that betrayal too, in her own way. We found common ground in our shared experiences of loss and rebuilding. Over time, we became friends, friends who began to spend more time together outside of work. We'd go for walks in the park, grab coffee, and talk about life. Maria had a calm presence about her that soothed me. With her, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself or prove anything. I could just be. One day, we were sitting in the park after work, watching the sunset, when Maria looked at me and said something I hadn't expected. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about you lately," she said, her voice soft. "About your past. And I just want you to know that you don't have to carry all of that weight anymore. You're free now. You don't have to keep fighting." Her words hit me like a wave, washing over me. I had spent so many years fighting, trying to clear my name, trying to find some sense of justice, that I hadn't realized how much I was still carrying, how much weight I was still dragging around in my heart. "I don't know if I can ever fully let it go," I said, my voice quiet. "But I'm trying." "You will," she said, offering a small smile. "You'll find peace in your own time. It's not about forgetting what happened, James. It's about moving forward. You've already done more than most people could. You've survived." The next few months were a blur. I continued to rebuild my life in ways I never thought possible. Maria and I grew closer, and the more time I spent with her, the more I realized something. I had started to feel things again, things I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Happiness, hope, a sense of purpose. One day, Maria asked me if I wanted to come meet her son, Matt. He had just moved back into town after finishing his degree, and she wanted me to meet him. At first, I was hesitant. I wasn't sure how I'd be perceived. After all, I was still carrying the label of a convicted sex offender, even if I was now trying to rebuild my life. But Maria reassured me. "Matt's a smart guy. He won't judge you, I promise." So, I agreed. We met at a small restaurant near her apartment, and when I saw Matt for the first time, I was struck by how much he looked like Maria. He had the same easy smile, the same warm presence. But there was something else I couldn't quite place. He seemed familiar. As we sat down, the conversation flowed easily. I was surprised by how comfortable I felt. It was as though I had known Matt for years. But then, as the evening wore on, something unexpected happened. Maria had stepped away to the bathroom, and Matt and I were left alone at the table. "James," he said, his voice tentative, "there's something I need to tell you." I raised an eyebrow, wondering what he was getting at. "What's up?" Matt hesitated for a moment before continuing. "You probably won't believe this, but my mom and I have been talking, and I think I know why Rebecca treated you the way she did." I felt my stomach tighten. "What are you talking about?" Matt took a deep breath. "She's not just carrying Ryan's child, James. She's carrying Derek's too. But there's more." I overheard her talking to Ryan about something. I think she was trying to manipulate him into marrying her. She was scared that the truth would come out, that Derek was the real father. She didn't want to lose everything. I stared at Matt, my mind racing. It didn't make sense. How could this be possible? Had Rebecca really been that reckless? Matt looked at me, his expression serious. "I think you've been wronged in more ways than you realize, James. And I don't think it's too late for you to make things right." It was a bombshell. I had no idea what to say. Maria had been right to suggest I move on, but now I was faced with a whole new truth, one that could change everything. This wasn't just a matter of revenge or closure. This was a matter of justice. And for the first time in a long time, I had a chance to finally expose the full extent of Rebecca's betrayal. The twist was too big to ignore. I had spent so long trying to get my life back in order, but now I realized that the final pieces of my puzzle were falling into place. What I thought was the end of Rebecca's betrayal was only the beginning. But this time I wasn't going to let her or Derek win. I would fight for the truth. And more importantly, I would fight for my children. I had spent years being consumed by the desire to make things right, to seek vengeance. But now I saw a different path. One where I didn't have to prove anything to anyone, where I didn't have to go after Rebecca's new life. No, now I realized that I could take the power back, by simply being a better man, by focusing on the future, not the past. As for Rebecca, Her world would continue to crumble, piece by piece, as the truth came to light. She had lost everything, and now it was time for her to face the consequences of her lies. But this time, it wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. And with the help of Maria and Matt, I would make sure the truth was known, once and for all. For the first time in my life, I was walking towards something I had never thought I could reach: peace. James stood in the park, his mind racing. The revelation from Matt had shattered the final illusion that Rebecca had created around herself. It wasn't just Ryan's child she was carrying. It was Derek's too. The careful web of lies that Rebecca had spun for years was beginning to unravel. But what did it all mean now? What could he do with this newfound knowledge? The truth was, James had never been so confused. He had already lost so much, so many pieces of himself, his dignity, his sense of justice. But now, with this unexpected twist, he found himself in an even deeper hole. The idea that Rebecca had been deceiving not just him, but everyone, made him question his own role in everything. Had he been blind? Was it possible he had been too focused on his own pain to see the bigger picture? For the first time, James wasn't sure what to do next. He couldn't just walk away. He had spent too long seeking closure, fighting for his name to be cleared, but now the truth was different. The full extent of Rebecca's betrayal, the lies she had lived with, the manipulations that had led him to his darkest moments. He had a chance to expose it all. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized he owed it to himself and to his children to do just that. But how? How could he take all this knowledge, this wreckage, and turn it into something that would right the wrongs done to him, and more importantly, to Grace and Ethan? He couldn't just live in the past anymore. It was clear that Rebecca was doing everything in her power to move on, burying her mistakes beneath a facade of perfection. But James wasn't going to let her get away with it any longer. James wasn't sure what to make of the situation. The news from Matt had left him reeling, but there was something in the back of his mind that kept him grounded. There was no going back. He had already paid too high a price for his past mistakes and the betrayals that had been forced upon him. But now, he had something more important to fight for: the truth. Maria had become an unexpected source of strength for James. What started as casual conversations over lunch had grown into something deeper, a connection built not on pity, but understanding. Maria was a woman who had been through her own share of struggles. She had a son who had grown into a man of his own, and she was not someone to be easily swayed by emotional appeals. She had made it clear from the start. She wasn't interested in rescuing anyone, but she did believe in second chances, and she believed in justice. "I know you're thinking about going to the press," Maria said one evening after work as they sat in the small apartment James had rented. The air was thick with the weight of their conversation. James had been quiet, his fingers tapping restlessly against the table as he thought over everything he had learned. "But what do you want to achieve by doing that? Are you trying to destroy Rebecca? Or are you trying to make things right?" Her question hit James hard. He had always been driven by a sense of righteous anger. He had wanted to expose Rebecca, to tear her life apart as she had torn his. But now, with this new information, he was unsure. He wasn't the same man who had been wronged so terribly years ago. He had changed. He had started building something for himself, something he hadn't had before: peace. "I don't know," James said, his voice low. "I've spent so much time focusing on punishing her for what she did. But what's the point? The truth is out there now. The world knows what she did to me." Maria leaned forward, her expression serious. "But it's not about her anymore, is it? It's about you. What do you want, James? You can't just keep living in her shadow. You got to find your own path forward." The weight of her words settled on him like a heavy blanket. It was true. He had been living for so long in the wake of Rebecca's betrayal that he had never truly considered what he wanted beyond the revenge, the justice, the closure. Maria was right. The truth had to be part of the equation, but it didn't have to define his future. He could choose something else, something better. James stood up, looking out the window at the city lights. He had spent too many years obsessing over things beyond his control. But now, with Maria's support, he realized it was time to take control of his own story. James spent the next few weeks carefully considering his options. The truth about Rebecca's affair with Derek and the pregnancy that had come from it was a bombshell. but he knew that exposing it all wouldn't necessarily give him peace. In fact, he was starting to see that it would only further entrench him in the past. What good would it do to drag everything into the light again, just to see her suffer? After all, she had already lost everything. Her marriage to Ryan was fragile. She had been exposed for who she really was, and there was no amount of manipulation or lies that could hide her true nature now. Instead, James decided to take a different approach, one that would not just expose Rebecca, but reclaim what had been lost. He would focus on rebuilding his own life and making sure that Grace and Ethan knew the truth in their own time. They deserved to know that their father hadn't just been a passive victim. He had fought for them, and he would always fight for them, even if they never understood the full extent of the battle. With Maria's encouragement, James reached out to a lawyer who specialized in family law. They discussed his case and the potential to gain full custody of Grace and Ethan. It wasn't going to be easy. Rebecca was still their mother, and the legal system wasn't exactly on his side. But James knew he had one thing that would tip the scales in his favor: the truth. Maria supported him every step of the way. She helped him prepare the necessary documents, and when the time came to take action, she stood by him, providing not just legal support, but emotional strength. For the first time in a long time, James realized that the key to moving forward wasn't revenge. It was taking back control of his life. And that meant fighting for his children. It was during one of the meetings with his lawyer that the most unexpected twist of all came to light. James had been investigating every avenue he could think of, searching for any piece of evidence that might help his case, when something entirely unexpected happened. While reviewing old communications between Rebecca and Derek, he found an email exchange between them from a few months before Grace and Ethan had been born. It was a casual exchange at first, but then it became clear that Derek wasn't just an advisor to Rebecca during their affair. He had been giving her advice on something much darker, a plan to make sure that Ryan believed the child was his. The email contained a shocking confession. Rebecca had known all along that Ryan wasn't the biological father of the child. Derek had helped her orchestrate the entire affair, manipulating Ryan into believing he was the father, while secretly ensuring that the child was actually Derek's. It was a double betrayal, one aimed at both James and Ryan. This information hit James harder than anything else. He had already known that Rebecca had lied about the paternity of the child, but now he had concrete proof of the lengths she had gone to in order to keep the truth from coming out. She had used Derek not only to manipulate James, but also Ryan. She had ruined two men's lives, one out of spite and the other out of greed. James knew exactly what he needed to do now. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about destroying Rebecca. It was about taking the control back, about exposing the truth, not just for himself, but for his children. He would make sure that Grace and Ethan knew the full story when they were old enough to understand it. But more than that, James knew he had to walk away from the wreckage. Rebecca's world had collapsed, but it didn't have to be his downfall. He had a new life now, one that was free of the toxic hold she had on him. Maria had given him a new perspective, a chance to build something real. In the months that followed, James fought for his children's custody. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks, but he finally managed to secure full custody of Grace and Ethan. The court documents, combined with his evidence of Rebecca's manipulations, helped tip the scale in his favor. And with that, James's life began to change. The man who had once been beaten down by betrayal and loss found peace in the most unexpected place, with his children, with the truth, and with the future that Maria had helped him see. For the first time in a long time, he could look forward, not back. And that, James realized, was the greatest victory of all.